Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Something to Drink On. I'm your host, No Crook, and I have my friend here, JStemz, aka Jonathan Stemrick. He is a pastor. He is a friend of mine. Went to seminary together. And today, his drink of choice is a steak and shake milkshake, specifically the peanut butter chocolate shake. So, John, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Today was kind of a little bit of a big day for me, as we talked a little bit before we started recording. But yeah, I actually delivered the hard copy of my master's thesis to the library at Anderson University, where I did my seminary work, and so that essentially is the last step in the process. So as of today, I'm completely done with my degree. So it's kind of a big day for me. So I suppose. Traditionally, we probably should be drinking champagne right now, but my drink of choice for celebrating was a milkshake, a frozen treat here. So, yeah,
Yeah, it's a cheat day because he's on a keto diet, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
keto diet,
Yeah.
down 13 pounds so far, but I'm
Yeah.
having a little treat day. We'll call it a treat
A
day.
treat cheat day.
Yeah, treat cheat day.
All
Yes.
right. So, one thing, first of all, congratulations on becoming a master's of theology.
No, yeah, thank you,
Or
thank you.
master of theology. It's kind of like a master of the universe,
Well,
but
a
not
master
as.
of theological studies. I don't know if you could ever become a master of theology.
I don't know. Maybe.
Um,
There's a few people who thought they had it down.
Yeah. The funny thing about the degree is I think the biggest takeaway that I got from this degree is essentially that now I kind of understand theology when I read it a little bit. So
Yeah.
there's a lot of theology out there that I still haven't read,
Yeah.
and a lot of times people ask me, "Oh, have you read so and so? Have you read so and so? Have you read so and so?" I'm like, "Nope, nope, and nope," but I might get around to it at some point in time, and now I feel like I have the tools, the equipment, so to speak, to be able to enter into dialogue with theologians, both contemporary and classically.
Right.
Yeah.
Which is really just kind of the big word phrasing of I understand enough to keep learning and understanding.
Pretty much, yeah.
Pretty much.
And I've learned enough to know how much there is that I don't know.
Oh God, that's a tough part to be in.
Yeah.
I don't think I'm at that point. I like to pretend like I know everything. That way, I have a false sense of security. You know?
Mm.
Yeah.
Well, even in the process of writing a master's thesis, I can say confidently that, except for maybe one specific area of my thesis, which I probably am the leading expert on, which was about a third of the project, but for the other two-thirds of the project, although I probably know more about those topics than the majority of the population, I'm still nowhere near an expert on them, and there's still so much more I could learn on them. So
Well, and what specifically was your thesis topic? Just since we're talking about it.
sure, yeah. My thesis topic was nationalism and the Free Methodist Church during the World War I era.
So, like a very historical basis for your thesis.
Yeah, it would be considered a church history paper. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Cool.
Yeah, and so the three areas that I kind of delved into was the history of nationalism, just on a broad scale, and sort of did that in conversation with theology. So a lot of questions about why should the church even care about nationalism, and I kind of brought into that theology in terms of idolatry and theology in terms of ethics.
Right.
And that's the area where, yes, I know a good deal about it, but I'm nowhere near an expert, even after having written a chapter of a thesis on that topic.
Right.
And then I delved a little bit into World War I history, particularly the American home front and the reaction of the American churches to the war. Again, something I know a great deal about, but nowhere near an expert on.
Right.
And then for the final chapter, I actually used primary sources that would have been published by the Free Methodist Church during the 2 years that the United States was involved in the war. And so, if somebody were to ask, what was the reaction of the Free Methodist Church in its publications to the war, that would be the one area that I'm probably the leading expert on at this point.
Okay.
So
a leading expert, a relative expert, and a non-expert is kind of what it comes down to.
yeah.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah, probably closer to the non-expert on most of it. But
On most of it.
yeah.
Well,
It,
I definitely I have not still watched the YouTube video, but I have it saved. I need to watch it.
no, okay.
Of you actually giving your thesis, because that I did see that on Facebook. I was super excited, and then I just got distracted with a lot of other things that have been coming up, which we'll get to here shortly.
Sure.
But yeah, I even when you were telling me about your paper and talking about it, the church history side of it is interesting,
Mm-hmm.
because as much as I am not a fan of some of church history, and how I'm not a fan of some things in its current era,
Mm-hmm.
it's fascinating to see the development and to see where the church stood out on certain things, how it reacted, and seeing how that evolved. Much like just studying history is interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I'd be hyped to see that. I do want to ask, so I don't forget, John, what is your favorite color and why?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I knew you were going to ask me that question, and truth be told, I don't know that I really have a favorite color. Um, But if I was gonna pick one, I would probably say green, mostly because green is the color of money, and I'm all about that paper. So
That's why you became a
that's
pastor.
why I became a pastor. I actually picked, and I could be incorrect on this, so don't take this one to the bank. And that seemed like the appropriate expression since we're talking about money. But I do believe that having a master's degree from a seminary is the what's the word I'm thinking of here? It is the grossest.
Epitome.
No, not epitome, but the grossest inverse relationship of level of education to level of income. So, in other words, you have the least of all of the master's degrees that you could achieve, you could acquire. You have the least earning potential with a master's
Yes.
of divinity or of theological studies. Where if I had got an MBA, I would be making like six figures right now, which I'm
Right.
not making anywhere near that. Although that being said, I'm very grateful that the church that I am at now does pay me enough that I can earn a living, and
Right.
I don't have to be bivocational.
Not to
And
mention that with certain churches, you get certain perks, like a place to live,
yes, yeah,
things paid for. Like, it's kind of like working a non-for-profit job for
mm-hmm,
people who know working non-for-profit. You tend to get better benefits,
mm-hmm, sure,
but the pay may not be exactly what you would want to expect from that. Yeah.
right, right, right.
Um, and speaking of that, you very recently became the pastor of your church. How long
Yes.
has it been now?
It's been probably I guess it's been about 2.5 months. It was the end of
Yeah,
June,
yeah, that
the
sounds
end of
right.
June that I started. So, yeah.
How's that been going?
It's been going well. It really has. It has been kind of interesting because as we've already kind of covered here, I have been finishing up the thesis project. So in a lot of ways, I feel like my ministry at the church there has really only is really only just now beginning, because so much of my time has been split between the church and finishing that project.
Right.
And so I haven't been able to do a whole lot there, besides just the very basic things.
Getting your feet wet, getting used to everything.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And so right now, I think one of the biggest things that I'm probably my biggest project or my biggest endeavor at the moment is just figuring out the best way to kind of manage my time a little bit. Uh,
Oh, yeah,
yeah,
especially now that you have a baby as well that happened
yeah,
this year.
right. That's true. Yeah, it's been a big year. Yeah, I became a pastor, finished
Finished
my
your
degree, and
master's,
I
got a
became a
baby.
father for the first time. Yeah,
Yeah.
so. And yeah, that is hard. I mean, it can be really hard to find the balance. And I will say that I definitely have to give a huge shout out to my wife for really just really bucking up and taking a lot of the baby responsibilities upon herself. And she's been very gracious and very understanding. We decided though that when we found out we were pregnant that we weren't gonna let that keep me from finishing my degree, and so we were both together as a team. We were determined to make sure that I finished, and so yeah. So one good thing is now that this thesis project is done, I am going to be a little bit more guarded of my time off and of my family time, which will be a good thing. So I'll get to spend more time investing in them, and it'll be a really good thing. I'm really looking forward to that.
And learning practice and setting boundaries on a church, which I mean, you got to do that relatively as a youth pastor, but more so now that you're a head pastor, that'll be kind of a fun little thing to start working with.
Yeah, and that is so like that is. I mean, I don't think it's any secret really that people who tend to be attracted to ministry work are people who have a hard time saying no and have a hard time setting boundaries. And the church that I'm at is a very small church,
Right.
and very tight knit, very very loving people, and so they're kind of becoming like family. So setting boundaries is sort of like setting boundaries with your family,
Right.
and so it is something that does need to be done, because pastors do need to safeguard their mental health, and
Right.
they do need time to rest and recharge their batteries, and so it is important to set boundaries. But at the same time, I really enjoy being with my church, and so it's sometimes I don't want to like say no to things, because I like these people, and I like
Right.
being in relationship with them.
Right. No, and I think that's a difficult thing for any pastor, and really any position where you're somebody who just wants to give.
Mm.
And we talked about kind of some of your transitions that you've had.
Mm-hmm.
I actually was just offered a job at a domestic violence shelter.
Yeah, which is great. Yeah, that's really good.
Yeah, it's crazy. The funniest part about the interview is I kept talking with her, the woman who was interviewing me, and we kept discussing the kind of the similarities between customer service and I guess emergency situation jobs,
Mm.
where you just have a lot of people coming in who need help, and you have some people who come in and don't need help but say they do,
Mm.
and just various situations like that. And I'm like, yeah, with a ministry background, with a little bit of a ministry background, and then with the psych background and everything else I've had to deal with, and what I went through for college, I'm like, yeah, this seems like a good fit, and ended up getting the job, and I'm super excited about it. Feel like I'm finally going into a field, or at least a job field, similar to what I spent 4 years and 4 years worth of college tuition on.
Mm.
So that's probably really the thing I'm most excited for at the moment.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, conversely, you could have gone the route that I went, where I had spent 4 years, well, really like 4.5 years, working towards a bachelor's degree, and then got into my field, worked in it for less than a year, and had decided that there's no way that this is for me. This is so clearly not a good fit for me, even though I spent 4.5 years and however many thousands of dollars getting that degree.
Well, the funny thing is with that's where I thought I was
Mm.
for the past year or so. Again, John, knowing that I me from seminary and that's how we met and became friends. He knows what I've been dealing with for the most part. He knows why I have the perspective on the church that I do for the most part. Um, and one of the things that hurt me the most was the fact that I just completely turned my back on this idea of going into ministry. I completely gave up on it because I thought this obviously isn't the place for me. This isn't where I need to be putting my time and investment into. I'm better off just going and getting a job and living right now. And another unique transition I didn't expect is I'm going back to church as well, which has no real relevance to any other conversations I've had with any other friends. Just my other pastor friend Ryan, who he's just been kind enough to sit and talk with me a few times, and even just the hour-long conversations we've had. I went this past Sunday and just was convinced that it's something I need to start doing again.
Mm.
And I think there may be hope for that to be a possibility again, and that's not where I would have been a year ago.
Mm.
So it's already turning into a big year for me.
Mm.
Not as big as yours. Don't have any kids. Don't have a master's degree yet. But getting into a job field I want, and finally getting back to finding a church that is I don't feel as toxic.
Mm. Yeah, and I mean, there's really no need to relativize, or is that a word even, relativize? Anyway,
I don't know. You're the masters here.
yeah, I know I'm supposed to have a vocabulary of 10,000 words, but
I'm sure you do. That was just the one you don't.
yeah, that was just one I'm missing. But I mean, there's no reason to do that, because you and I are also kind of in different stations in our life. I mean, I'm also almost a
Absolutely.
decade older than you,
Oh, well,
and
no, we didn't have to tell them that.
yeah, but and I think we started off kind of on different paths too, so it
Oh,
kind of
absolutely.
it kind of makes sense that we would wind up in different places.
Yeah,
Um,
that's something I mean we've talked about a little bit, but you used to do some stuff. We won't have to get into too much of that, but that is another transition though that I know we've talked a little bit about,
mm.
but you never really went in depth with it. It was more just kind of like, yeah, one day I just something hit me and I just kind of became a Christian, and then I felt this call and
Well, I mean,
followed the line.
if you want, I can share a little bit of
Yeah,
that with you.
yeah, that's what I'm asking you to do.
All right. Well, the truth be told, and I think a little bit of my time was spent as a youth pastor. I was working very part time as a youth pastor for most of the time that I was in seminary, and a lot of my experience as a person who grew up in church, and I really was. I mean, I really did grow up in church. From the time I was an infant, my mom, made sure that my brother and I were in church every Sunday. And not only that, but she taught a Bible study class on Monday nights, and she was in the choir. So we were in the church on
So you had
Mondays,
the church
Wednesdays,
mom.
and Sundays. Yeah, really, we did. And so, but I think a lot of my approach to youth ministry was colored by things that I experienced as a youth who had gone through youth ministry.
Right.
And for me, it seemed like so much of what we were being taught it was all morality based.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
it was like if you shouldn't listen to rap music, and you shouldn't be friends with people who aren't Christians, and
Hmm.
if you do these things and so for me, a lot of times I walked around with a really unhealthy sense of what is sin, and as somebody who has prayed that prayer and who's been baptized, what role does sin play in my life?
Right.
Those were questions that I really wrestled with, and so when I went off to college, for all intents and purposes, I pretty much just abandoned my faith.
Right.
It just wasn't something that was really that important to me for that period of time.
Right.
And I think a lot of it was just because there was such an emphasis on morality, and not enough of an emphasis of like who God is and who you are, and what it means to be a new creation in Christ. And
Right.
it's certainly much more than morality,
Right.
and,
Or staying away from the bad.
right, right.
Yeah.
And so yeah, so when I was in college, yeah, I got a little bit wrapped up in, I guess, what you might call the party lifestyle, and I did an experiment with some recreational drugs, and some things like that. But then, shortly after college, I was still kind of in that lifestyle. But in all honesty, it was played out.
Lost its luster.
Yeah, it
Yeah.
did. It just wasn't really something that I was enjoying anymore, and so I moved away from the town that I was living in to kind of remove myself from some of the bad influences there. And it was in that period that I started dating my wife, and it was also in that period that I got invited to attend a men's Bible study, and uh, almost like anyone who's might be listening to this who's at all familiar with Wesleyan theology, in John Wesley's life, one of the most formative experiences he had was what we often call his Aldersgate experience, which was the first time that he ever felt that his faith was something that he actually felt in his heart. It
Right.
wasn't just a head
Yeah.
faith.
Yeah.
And during that men's Bible study, that was the first time that I'd had that experience. And some of the things that the preacher who was preaching said was really, looking back, it was such basic theology, but it was theology that I was never taught as a kid growing
Yeah.
up in church.
It was something fresh. It was something new.
And
Something maybe even a little bit more mature.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And so a lot of the things that I had wrestled with previously started to make a little bit of sense to me, and it was a very gradual change. But at that point, I think that was probably about October of 2015, I think it was. And No, it had to have been before that. That's my fault. Probably October of 2012 was probably when that was. Um, I just kind of, I don't know. I just thought, maybe I need to be rethinking my faith a little bit, and
Hmm.
maybe I need to start taking this a little bit more seriously again. And so, she was my fiance at the time, but her and we started visiting some churches. I started diving into the scriptures a little bit more. And when we did start getting more involved in a church, I got involved in a young adult ministry there,
Hmm.
just as a lay person, but kind of taking on a little bit of a leadership role.
Right.
And it was one of the first times in my life where I was like, this just feels like where I should be at. This is
Yeah.
this is what I should be doing. And so, uh, you know, a couple 3 years after that, after kind of resisting it and wrestling with it and all of these things, I finally decided to dive in and explore what a career in ministry might look like a little bit. And the biggest step in that was just enrolling in seminary to try to educate myself a little bit more. Not really knowing where it was leading, but certain that I was being called to something.
Right.
Sort of like a pretty common, biblical theme, kind of the hey, just go where I tell you to go, and kind of like an Abrahamic thing.
Just keep moving forward.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and I mean, that's to some extent that's similar to how I felt my call was when I was in high school,
Mm.
because I felt called to ministry, and then I just let that die for a little bit. But originally, it was this idea of I was at a youth camp, and I'm sitting there, and I see all these teenagers around me, and I'm like, God, you're investing in these kids' lives, and this is like the most beautiful thing ever. And I'm like, oh, these people are my age. Why am I so excited about this idea of this shaping, this formation,
Mm.
this interaction with God being so important for everyone else? And I was like, oh, because I give a crap. Like, I care about people knowing who God is. So from that point forward, I was like, well, ministry, obviously.
Mm.
So, I come to college, spend 4 years doing youth ministry psych, try to go to seminary because I didn't know what to do after I graduated from undergrad,
Mm.
and also because bills are hard to pay and getting student loans to help pay for things was easier.
Uh,
Yeah, I mean, when you have pretty much campus housing, it is a thing. But yeah, for me it was something around the idea of youth ministry originally, and then kind of developed into maybe this could be more. And then now I'm finally back to the point of like, okay, well maybe I can go back to church.
mm.
But that in between part is kind of the part that I mean, you know a lot about. Essentially, just a lot of hurt, a lot of um, me already being cynical with studying the church and seeing how things can go, and seeing how toxic and hurtful it can be, even to other people we knew that were in ministry and other churches around us.
Uh-huh.
It's just something that can be dangerous for people to be a part of.
Mm.
And I mean that on a leadership level as well as a layperson level, but I think it more heavily hits the leadership.
Mm.
Um, and the only time it will hit lay people is when you have other people who are members of the congregation who are judgmental and who aren't listening to what's actually going on.
Mm-hmm.
Which, I mean, that happens too. And I know plenty of people I've talked to from high school or otherwise who refuse to go to church because, well, that's just a place I'm going to be judged. Well, that's
Mm-hmm.
just a place. And that is 100% the reason I wanted you to be on the show.
Mm.
Your history, how you felt ministry develop in your life, this call to God, religion in general in your life develop, was from you were living a lifestyle that when you were in youth group, you would not have been friends with those other Christian kids. They would have avoided you.
Yeah, surely.
And I mean that right there is what I think is so beautiful about the church. It is a place for saints and sinners.
Mm.
It's a place for us to come together and recognize this God that's bigger than all of us.
Mm-hmm.
And Nate and I, obviously, we try to expand on that more than we should sometimes. We almost get universalist with it. I think he just straight up is, yeah, I'm a universalist. I'm not convinced that far yet, but that when you mentioned we weren't supposed to be friends with kids that did X, Y, and Z,
Yeah.
that reminded me so much of what bothers me with the church. It's not
Mm.
just the judgmental side. It's coming up from high school to a college where everybody there went through pretty much the exact same youth ministry mentality, who are all living in this community that's supposed to be centered around Christ, but it didn't have any maturity to it.
Mm.
And I know when we were in seminary, I would constantly complain about people on campus who were undergrads who had this mentality or that mentality about faith, and it was just this kind of toxic or like this. I don't even want to say conflated, maybe more conflicting idea of who they are, who God is, and how that matches and how they treat people.
Mm.
And it's just kind of this mess sometimes because when you have the majority of people going to church when they're younger and growing up through church because their parents want them to go to church,
Mm-hmm.
which isn't a bad thing. But you have a lot of youth ministries where people are just told not to do things
Mm-hmm.
because we're taught preventative measures, not healthy life
Yeah.
or healthy religion.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, even recently I was watching a documentary on purity balls, like the right. Yeah, we laugh because
yeah,
exactly. But it was this idea that these purity balls and people who would, speak at youth groups, go to schools and tell them abstinence is the only way. It was like one of the groups was like the silver ring thing. I think that's what it was called.
yeah, that sounds right.
Yeah,
I think I've heard of that.
Well, I that was not mine. I think that was a generation right before mine. Which I mean, that's exactly where you are. You're that decade before, school wise.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And the sad thing is that mentality is still. It was there 20 years ago. It's there 10 years ago when I was in youth group, and it's still going to be there now. And that's the point of the church that I think needs correcting as well, because a lot of churches have tried so hard to focus on youth groups to get young people and to get families.
Mm-hmm.
Well, when you have a youth group that doesn't have really solid substance but just tells them to stay away from things and teaches morality rather than religion,
a
healthy religion, let me clarify,
Mm-hmm.
You don't get anything out of it.
Mm.
You're just blowing hot air in everybody's faces, and they're like, "Yeah, I'd rather go out and sit in the actual sunlight than have to deal with a lot of smelly breath and possibly being judged for making decisions that aren't even necessarily bad, but aren't what other people think is right."
Yeah.
I know that was a lot. I kind of rambled there. I apologize.
Yeah, that was kind of a lot. Yeah, I'm not sure if there was like really a question for me in that, or if that
Well,
was.
I guess just handing that off to you, saying, what would your commentary be on that idea of youth group and that idea of ministry? Obviously, you didn't think it was enough when you were younger, but like looking back on it now and seeing how that's still similar to how we teach teenagers who are becoming adults to see God. What are your thoughts?
Okay, yeah. Well, I mean, I think for me, um, this might almost be. Some people might say that this is almost like too abstract or almost like a cop out, and I think I mean, I'll acknowledge that I could maybe see why somebody would take that approach to this, but I think that the emphasis needs to shift from being negative to being positive. So it's not so much about this is what you shouldn't do because the Bible says it's wrong, but it should be more like, well, let's start with what Jesus affirmed to be the greatest commandment that God ever gave his people, which was to love God.
And love others.
And when Jesus says that a second that is like it is to love your neighbor as yourself, um, you know, there's obviously Jesus is drawing a picture of a strong connection between those two. So in other words, you're not able to love God if you're not a person who loves your neighbor as yourself, and you're not able to really truly, I think in the most the truest sense, you're not able to love others if there's not an aspect of recognition of your status as an image bearer of God or something like that. And so then what we could say is like, let that be our central teaching, and let's be focused more on how can we be like better, more loving followers of Christ. Right. And then if we're devoted to that wholly, as in like fully, not as in like
Well,
HOOY.
I mean,
Yeah.
it applies though.
Yeah, yeah. But if we're devoted to that fully, then I think it's going to give us a much stronger, less flimsy base for if we want to teach purity or something like that. It's more than just saying like don't do it because it's bad. There's and then from that we can say, well, maybe here are some reasons why we might consider purity as a life choice rather than just purity has to be your life choice.
Right.
So that's probably a little bit on the abstract side as far as an answer goes.
The funny thing is, it's not really that abstract. I mean, you gave a pretty direct answer. I mean, you have that be the basis, and then you teach from that. I think that's... I mean, I agree. That's very much how I would do ministry and how I would teach people as well.
Mm.
It's just, for me, the idea of sexual purity is not... It's displayed in the Bible in some ways, and it's also not condemned in other ways. It's kind of weird, because you see Jesus constantly going to people who... The woman at the well. My favorite analogy.
Sure.
This woman who obviously has, and I actually use this exact same reference with Nate, this woman who's had many men, not all of them her husbands,
Mm-hmm.
and Jesus comes to her when nobody else will. It's this fascinating idea that there's this openness Jesus has, even to people he disagreed with, because they even argue a little bit because the Samaritan versus the Jewish perspective on like where to worship, and it's funny because it's just this little spat, and then it just kind of overwhelmingly becomes, I am the Messiah, and she just has this amazing moment of, not only is this person talking to me, he knows who I am, he doesn't want something from me like everybody else did, and he's not judging me, and it's this beautiful moment of healing that I don't see often, that mentality in the church. I don't see an acceptance of where other people are at.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, I mean, I absolutely would agree that that is true in a lot of cases, and I absolutely know why you would say that. But something that I would say that I'm noticing as a positive trend in the church, and particularly even in my denominational setting, which, as might be able, to have presumed from the fact that I wrote a paper about the Free Methodist Church, is my denominational context is the Free Methodist Church. And I'm seeing a very positive trend of teaching along those lines.
In that denomination?
Yeah, yeah. Okay, cool. And the idea that, somebody who is here worshiping with us, hearing the gospel preached, being poured into, being mentored, who is seeking Jesus, even if they still have a lot of these problems in their life, that is something to be celebrated.
There's still redemption, there's still healing, there's still the son that we throw a party for.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. And so really the fact that people like that are in the church should be not something that we're condemning and saying like, well, oh, what will people think about us if there's people like that in our church? It should be like, more like, hey, they're like, Jesus is clearly present in this church because these people are here and they're coming back and they're welcome. And and I think one thing,
and they're finding something different.
Yes. Yeah, and I think one thing that people kind of tend to get a little bit, I don't want to use the word hung up on because that sounds a little bit overly negative, but
it's also kind of true.
Yeah, and it's the evening, and I've been up since early this morning, so I'm probably,
you might as well.
Yeah. So let's just say, acknowledging that it might not be the best way to say it. One thing that people do get a little bit hung up on is this idea of, if I'm with this person, does that mean that I condone this behavior?
Oh my gosh.
And I mean, it is true, and so I think that's something that we need to recognize. So this is like almost like an epiphany I had recently, and I'd been reading a lot on this topic, so it was probably something I was led to more than something that I just came up with.
Right.
But like one topic that has been just one of the, I would say probably like one of the dominant topics in the church over the last 20, 30 years, maybe even before that, but I can't remember because I'm only 33 years old, so I don't know, but has been the topic of like same-sex relationships.
I was actually just about to bring that up.
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
And so this is my thought on it. Even though I think that some of the churches that we would call fully affirming churches, so churches that will essentially say that it is okay to be in a same-sex monogamous relationship,
right.
And will even ordain clergy members who are
Right.
in same-sex monogamous relationships. The truth is that that is not the majority view in the church. Most
Right.
churches are not fully affirming churches.
Absolutely.
Most churches hold to what we would call the traditional view of marriage. The idea that marriage is a covenant between one man and one woman, and that's really the only biblically prescribed model for marriage.
Right.
Okay, so where most churches stand on it.
Right.
And so if you have a gay person that is attending your church, they know what the traditional view of marriage is in the church, and they probably know that your church holds the traditional view.
Right.
Okay, so you bringing that to their attention or drawing attention to that in any kind of way, there's no need for it. They already know. Okay, and and so by allowing them to participate in worship, you are not somehow condoning a lifestyle that your church believes is
something that you disagree with.
Right. You're not condoning it because they already know.
Right.
And so instead it's saying like, okay, well, something that you wrestle with, and let's face it, for a gay person in the United States and the Western world in general, there are some challenges that come along with that.
Oh, absolutely.
And there is,
absolutely.
there are people who
you have stigma, you have negative things, yeah.
So when I say they wrestle with it, I mean really this has been something that has been
their entire life.
Yeah, a source of difficulty in their life, and sometimes pretty severe difficulty.
Right.
So somebody who wrestles with their sexuality, inviting them into a church setting and allowing them to, to worship with you, it sends a message to them that, hey, we really think you're more than just your sexuality, and you're a person to be loved.
Oh my gosh. That you are more than your sexuality. That is exactly what I'm talking about. That we're more than these little pieces of ourselves that we disagree with.
Mm-hmm.
Even adding on to that. So, well, two things I want to add on to that. The first one is there's actually a girl I work with right now who, she's lesbian, she's married, and I think before she was married, she was going to church with her grandparents. And at some point, during the middle of a sermon, the pastor says, and we should pray for these families because their children are struggling with being homosexual. In the middle of the service. And she's like, yeah, I walked out. And I was like, yeah, I don't blame you.
When he said these families...
Like, he specifically named the families. Like, he said, like, this person, like, this couple and this couple, because their children have decided to be homosexual.
He used the language of decided to be homosexual?
I don't know what the exact language was, but still, like, he essentially said, hey, pray for these two families because their children are gay.
Oh, okay, yeah.
In the middle of in the middle of preaching and providing that as a prayer, and I'm like, that is the kind of mentality we need to stay away from, obviously.
Yeah, it does seem a little bit odd to, so I guess there's two things I could say to that, not really knowing, like, the full details of what happened. I think it is something that the leadership in the church definitely needs to take strides to
be more sensitive towards,
be educated about, and know how to have conversations along those lines that are well informed. And I think even myself, I catch myself doing it too, where I sometimes when I talk about that topic, I say things that are kind of dehumanizing or condescending completely by accident, without any desire to be condescending or dehumanizing. And so that is like something that we have to be really really careful about. And it does seem probably pretty out of place to make a public spectacle of it. I know that if I had a member of my church who was struggling with just whatever it might be, like say alcoholism, and I'm not like equating
Right.
same-sex attraction with alcoholism,
Right.
but
something that would be seen as negative.
I would never in the middle of a church service stop and say, hey, let's make sure we pray for this person, he's struggling with alcoholism,
Because that'd be horrible.
unless he was like a recovering addict and was very open about this, and had really shared, maybe given testimony and shared it in front of the church.
Right, but even then,
like
it would still be awful because you're still saying you as a person, this is still a bad decision, even though you have a same-sex attraction. Like, it still has that undertone. It still has that kind of hidden meaning to it. By standing up and saying that in the middle of a sermon is what I was getting at.
Okay.
As far as like somebody experiencing something negative in the church on that end, the funny thing is she told me, I guess her grandparents had convinced her to go back to the church at some point. They had a new pastor.
Okay.
Shook her and her wife's hand, introduced her wife and everything, and she was like, yeah, no, that pastor was a lot better. He interacted with us on a human level, and I think that's what you were getting at.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
The other side of it is the idea of accepting sexuality in the church. So that reaction to somebody being homosexual, I think is very similar to the reaction of seeing a single mother. Or seeing a woman who's pregnant out of wedlock.
Okay, yeah.
Something like that. Like, you see that too, and you see this kind of... You see two sides of a coin, maybe three. And I say three because it's the same side, but it's like a shadow side of it. So you have the heads, which is, I can't believe she had sex before she was married.
Yeah.
Going back to that youth group mentality.
Sure.
This preventative idea that you're just not supposed to have sex unless you're married. And having like a completely unhealthy idea of what sex is. Or you have people who are like, oh man, she's pregnant, she's young, she's, or not even young, but she's single. How can we help? The shadow side of that, however, is pitying her and thinking less of her still, but being willing to help. And I think in both that scenario and with somebody who's coming out, who's a Christian or who's going to church, both of those need to be treated the same way, with respect and with dignity and with a humanness to them. And I think you're right. I don't want to give this credit, but I think you're right, that the church is getting better with that. But I think there are some big strides we have to take in how we're approaching it on a political, on a social, and on an individual level. Because I've heard so much hurt, and I've seen so much hurt, for sexuality in general, but also with people who I know who are gay, who just feel like, I could never be allowed in a church, or who were part of a church, and who couldn't be a part of a worship team, who couldn't worship God with the talents they had because they were gay. That, to me, doesn't make sense.
Yeah, that's...
on a Jesus level.
Yeah, that one especially, like, and I don't know that I'm really going to broach this topic too much here, but that one is kind of an interesting dynamic in the church when you talk about the worship aspect of it. There are definitely a lot of varying opinions of what exactly, like, to what degree is somebody who's on the worship team a leader in the church,
right?
And like, to what standard should we hold people who are taking this position? There are a lot of varying opinions on that question, and I have a little bit of personal experience in that realm too. But I think it's probably best for me to stay away from that right now.
No, and that's fair. But I mean, you mentioned earlier, some churches are completely open to that idea.
Yeah.
Some churches are completely open to the idea of people being pastors who are gay, which some churches would be like, oh, they're going to hell because they have a gay pastor. So like, there's literally two completely different sides to that story, and I don't think you land on either of those. I think you're in the middle because you're in a context, you're in a situation, you're coming out of a context in a situation where it's not to one side or the other, but they're trying to figure out what that path is and what's most loving.
Well, I think something, and there was something you just said that kind of put this thought in my head, and I think it might have been what you kind of just the general idea you were saying there as you kind of wrapped up about how there's different ways of looking at it, and some people are kind of in the middle, and some are on these other extremes. And I think this is and you also brought up, the like some of the socio-political ramifications of these issues too. I think that, and this is something I've been giving a lot of thought to recently, and I might even, I'm not going to say too much about it because it's still like in the very early kind of just the conceptual phase, but I've been thinking about doing like some video blogs and that kind of thing, and I think that this is one that I might touch on in one of those. Is something that I think is really good for people and the church, or well, I just made it sound like there's a difference between the church and people, but I guess I should say like people who are involved in a church community or people who are not involved in a church community.
Yeah.
To recognize how complex these issues are. I mean, topics of sexuality and
are already complicated.
Yeah, and if we get into the the
religious
topic
rhetoric
of same-sex attraction, and if we get into the topic of gender questions and things like that, the truth is these are very complex situations, and for a lot of people, there's this real strong desire to simplify them, and
in what way?
Well, I see it probably in the church.
More generalizing than necessarily simplifying.
Yeah, maybe so. But it's kind of one of these things where someone will say, if he's gay, that's a sin. And then I say, well, what do you mean by that?
Okay. In that sense, simplifying. Okay.
And so, for me, I heard a story recently, and this is another place where maybe what I said earlier about just being educated about these topics can be, really important. I heard a story recently about a young man who was a Christian, grew up in the church, was really a devoted follower of Christ. And in his adolescence, he began to experience unwanted same-sex attraction. So he never made a conscious choice to be gay. Nobody does make a conscious choice about where their sexual orientation is going to be. He didn't make a conscious choice to be attracted to the same sex any more than I made a conscious choice to be attracted to the opposite sex.
Right.
So he started experiencing these unwanted same-sex attractions, and they were unwanted because he grew up in a church and he didn't believe, he held the traditional view of homosexuality, but because he was such a devoted follower of Jesus Christ, he committed to a life of celibacy.
Yeah.
And so, in my opinion, somebody who experiences same-sex attraction, who, has devoted themselves to a life of celibacy, in a lot of ways, not only do I strongly believe that that their temptation is not, and being same-sex attracted, they've committed no sin, and in a lot of ways, by choosing a life of celibacy, they've shown up a lot of, for a better way of saying it, like a lot of straight Christians, and they've really shown the ability to be devoted to their faith more than a lot of other folks have. And the sad thing is, that gentleman was serving in a youth pastor position, and he went to the leadership of the church, and he shared with them
his
testimony.
Yeah.
And the reaction he got was one of like, well, at this point, there's no way we can let you around our children.
Right, because, oh my God.
And so this is just a lack of education, because somebody who struggles with same-sex attraction, and never does that carry the implication that they struggle with pedophilia.
Right.
I mean, sure, there are some people who struggle with both, but they're not, that one does not imply the other.
Right. There's not causation. There may be some correlation, but not to the point.
Well, there's a possibility that somebody can experience both.
Right.
But there are no way. There's no way that like one somehow magically leads to the other.
There's no evidence suggesting that.
Right.
Right.
Well, let me make sure I'm stating this clearly. What I'm saying is it is possible for a person to be both same-sex attracted and a pedophiliac.
Yeah.
But there's no like it's not like one is the other one, right? So it's many people who have same-sex attraction are not pedophiles.
Right.
Just as many people who experience opposite sex attraction are not pedophiles. Right? So, and then that same person that I've been talking about was essentially forced to resign their position. So somebody who had a same-sex attraction, had devoted themselves to a life of celibacy, was not allowed to serve in the church.
No history or hint or accusations of pedophilia at all.
Or even, not even that, or of even giving in to the same-sex attraction. So this person...
I'm saying it to your point, though.
Yeah.
This idea that, well, we can't allow him around my kids. But it's not... I don't think it's a pedophile thing. I think it's we don't want this gay person influencing our kids and making them think it's okay.
Oh, yeah.
I think that might be more the mentality behind it.
Yeah, you might be right. Yeah.
But yeah, no, I what was your point after that, though? Like, aside from...
Well, so this is a complex issue. So that's what I'm trying to say. So, somebody who experiences exclusive same-sex attraction, who has devoted themselves to a life of celibacy, is that somebody who should not be allowed to serve in the church? And my answer is no. Absolutely they should be allowed to serve in the church. The fact is, I'm a person who experiences exclusively same-sex. Rewind.
Gretchen just found something out.
Yeah, my wife is going to be shocked when she hears this. No, I'm somebody who experiences exclusively opposite sex attraction.
Right.
But, I mean, I don't know if I should be saying this on the air or whatever, but, you know, I have, my sexuality is pretty strong. And so, I would never dream of you know, entering into a sexual bond with somebody besides my wife.
Right.
But is the temptation there from time to time? Yeah, I mean, of course it is, because I'm a person and I experience temptation. I mean, the scripture tells us that even the Lord Jesus experienced temptation. And so, because I have a strong, healthy sex drive, should that bar me from service in the church?
Right.
Of course not.
No.
And most people would agree. But then why does it become a different issue or a different answer when it has to do with same-sex attraction?
Well, see, my argument even comes down to if they're in a monogamous relationship. Because, I mean, here's the thing. The church promoting monogamous relationships is okay to me.
Yeah.
I understand why that's very healthy, especially in the context of family situations. Now, promoting that, why can't that be expanded more to same-sex marriages?
Yeah, I mean, that's
within the church. And that comes to the other point of, well, do we see homosexuality as a sin? And I think that's, again, going back to our point, a lot of churches are trying to figure out where that lands, not just with their political, but with their personal and with their religious beliefs. And because they're trying to figure that out and they're trying to sort that, a lot of churches err on the side of what they perceive as caution of keeping themselves safe, rather than the side of caution of loving others. And I think that's where we're starting to see the church grow, as they're starting to lean more to the side of, well, our salvation isn't dependent on us not being friends with these people like we learned in youth group. It's dependent on how well we love people no matter what.
Right.
So, like, then to what extent do we develop that? Do we let that into the church? Do we allow people who are openly gay to be leaders? Do we allow them to be worship pastors? Do we allow them to be ordained? And I think the church is developing an idea of that, and they're starting to be more progressive in that. Me personally, I have trouble seeing sexuality as sinful. But that's also because of how I view creation and God a little bit differently than a lot of churches would. Where a lot of churches and pastors will read into the text and take it literally. I will look at the text and say, okay, well, this is also written by a bunch of priests who are trying to develop norms and practices that were different from the cultures around them, which did approve of homosexuality, which did approve of other things. Does that necessarily exclude those from a natural part of God's creation?
Yeah.
And what that can mean?
Yeah, I mean, really, really two of the things you described just now are, um,
My cat is just being all buddy with you right
yeah,
now, which sucks because you have allergies.
right, yeah, it's true. A little ball of toxins or allergens or whatever. But anyway, yeah, I mean, what you described right there, really, you touched pretty heavily upon, um, two of the bases of the arguments that churches that are fully affirming make. Which one of them is that basically what they say is that the discussions of same-sex relationships in the scripture don't have in mind our contemporary understanding of consenting monogamous
Healthy
relationships,
relationships.
right?
Yes.
And that is one of the common arguments that they have. I personally not been convinced of that argument.
Just yet,
There's
yeah.
actually a lot of evidence that does kind of refute that argument. And then the other one is essentially saying that, yeah, like you said, the a lot of those prohibitions were essentially trying to steer people away from pagan worship practices of the time. So things like sex orgies and like fertility ceremonies and like child sacrifices and like temple prostitution. And so the argument that a lot of the fully affirming churches make is that those were never really meant to be, um, you know, uh, binding for all of eternity and for all of humanity in all situations.
Right.
And so, yeah, that is also a pretty common argument that the fully affirming churches make. But another one that, again, I'm not completely satisfied with. I think it's
I think there's
yeah.
more relevance to that one than using the modernity or post-modernity argument,
Oh yeah.
saying, well, it's just not relating to our current situation.
Yeah. Well, yeah, there definitely are some though. Yeah, I mean, there are some who do say that too. But yeah, I mean, I think sometimes we really have to be careful about um, letting our contemporary judgments of something, change a belief
Right.
that's been a part of the Christian tradition for
Right.
thousands of years, and that's something that's actually interesting about the topic of sexuality or same sex attraction particularly. And as we continue to talk, um, I'm sure that people who might be listening to this will get a sense that I generally am kind of a traditionalist on this topic. I'm what you would probably call a moderate traditionalist.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
And so, in other words, like I am welcoming of the
LGBT.
members of the LGBT community in the church, um, but I'm not fully affirming. I guess would be
Yes.
the way to say it. But I was just going somewhere with that. I think I lost my train of thought a little bit. I was talking about. Oh yeah. Okay, I remember what I was going to say. The this one thing that the traditionalists, I think, in a lot of ways, do have right is that this is an issue in the church that only became controversial in the 20th century.
Oh yeah.
This was something that the church was pretty well settled on for most of the history of the church. Unlike other topics, like the role of women in ministry, that's been something that has been controversial for a good portion of the history of the church.
Absolutely.
And so that's one of the reasons that people who hold the traditional view, I think, sometimes get a little bit frustrated, is because it's often seen as simply sort of adapting our belief to match a modern or postmodern way of thinking. And I certainly don't think that would be enough to suddenly change our belief on something.
I would agree. I also think, on the other end of that, with the fully accepting church's mentality, or at least what I perceive it to be,
Uh-huh.
it seems more like Christ to take the man who has been possessed by demons, who has been cutting himself and harming himself because he doesn't know, well, because he's just been possessed by these things for so long. And you could argue what that freedom or what that freeing from those demons looks like for people who are homosexual. It could. I don't like the idea of, oh, we have to turn them straight. That's not what I'm saying.
Sure.
I'm saying, but the freedom of being able to embrace who they are, and then coming away looking completely normal and in their right mind, and then becoming leaders in the community that they're in. To me, that seems more in line with what Jesus did and what Jesus consistently taught than following a more Pauline, which followed the more Jewish tradition that was set up by these things that were trying to make them separate and in like their own community. Because really, Jesus doesn't hit on homosexuality much.
He doesn't, but he does affirm the traditional view of marriage.
He does, but that's because he's also affirming a healthy view of marriage. I would argue bringing that to our more modern idea of what marriage can look like. People who are straight can have healthy and unhealthy marriages. People who are gay can have healthy and unhealthy marriages. Is my opinion. Well, no, that's my belief. It's not even an opinion. I think people are people, and people can have healthy relationships no matter what, or unhealthy. Jesus affirms a healthy view of marriage, and that can be applicable to a same-sex marriage. Paul, on the other hand, hits more on the sexual immorality, hits more on the homosexuality, reinforcing the Jewish teachings that he had, reinforcing more of the separatist mentality of their religion, while also introducing and providing a base for the people who would listen to him, this idea of Jesus that came with it. Which is funny because like when you read Paul and you compare it to how we see how much of society is today, you see this very stark contrast with Jesus is good, Jesus is loving, Jesus will redeem you. All of this is bad. All of this being a lot of society. And for me, it's hard. It's hard for me, having been somebody who has been sexually active outside of marriage, who has had faults with being in the church, and who does look more critically at the church's traditions, to see that and not think, well, wait, is this just going with the idea of this exclusivity and this idea of being different? Or is this going with the idea that Jesus' redemptive power is more than just for the individual, but for the community? And for me, that's kind of where it comes from. And kind of hitting on that note of society, because I know we've been talking about this the same-sex issue in the church for a while. I want to shift just slightly, because I did tell you we'd talk about this. Seeing as a lot of things in society are negative, portrayed by the church. Entertainment. You and I both love movies. We both very much enjoy music. Different types of music, I would say, but we both enjoy music. What are your thoughts on the entertainment industry? Not necessarily how it portrays sexuality, because that's a whole other conversation. But just in general, entertainment being something healthy or something life-giving, is that possible in a church community?
To tell you the truth, this isn't a topic that I've really given a lot of thought to. I think with I think that there is. I mean, there is one thing about our culture that is really unique. You said that we have kind of different tastes in music. Talib Kweli, I don't know if you know who that is or not, but a hip hop artist had a lyric in one of his songs that I really liked a lot, and it was a simple like one line little lyric, but he said talking about I guess just people or society as if there is some entity that we can call society or whatever, but and it's that we are survivalists turned into consumers. And so I would say the vast majority of human history, entertainment was probably something that was in short supply. Probably only the noble people had access to entertainment on a regular basis.
Right.
But now, in a lot of ways, our culture is very much entertainment driven. I mean, the sadly one of the biggest. Well, I probably shouldn't get into that. That'll take us in a wrong direction. But the video game industry, the movie industry, television,
music industry,
streaming services like Hulu, Netflix, YouTube,
Disney.
Yeah, of course, Disney's a big one that's got their hands in a lot of that.
Well, no, they're getting their own streaming service now too.
Oh, are they? I didn't know that.
Yeah, they're taking all of their properties that are on different streaming services, and they're essentially just combining them for their own. So they're kind of monopolizing on the streaming idea, or the platform. But anyway, continue what you were.
Yeah. So I mean, not only that, but also sports and.
Oh, jeez.
Yeah, in a lot of ways, our our society is really, in a lot of ways, driven by entertainment. It seems like, and so I definitely don't think that there's anything inherently wrong with entertainment. I think. For me, my I guess look at it, or my take on it as a church leader would be that it's one of those things that we just have to keep in perspective. I mean, and I think something that this is something that has been a little bit that has been in the back of my mind. Something that I do sometimes get a little bit frustrated with is. I do think that we as members of the church need to be better about evaluating how we spend our free time. And how much of our free time is devoted to entertainment. And so I do believe in mental health, and that there are times that we need to be able to just unwind,
moderation,
and enjoy something that's light and entertaining.
Yes.
And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But I mean, I know for me, if I get into a place where I don't do this anymore, I refuse to do it, but. Whenever I would binge watch, that's a phrase that everybody today knows what that means, right? When I would binge watch something, I would feel just terrible afterwards because I was like,
you'd be empty almost.
I could have been using that time to better myself. I could have been using that time to pour into others. I could have been using that time to work on, in the ministry field, and so I do think that. That entertainment is not something that is necessarily an evil, but it can certainly become that. And I do think that as Christians, we have to, at least to some degree, consider what forms of entertainment we enjoy. So, I'm not a legalist, and you know that about me. So I'm not gonna say that as a Christian, you shouldn't watch movies that are R-rated.
Right.
Right.
Or not play video games that are M or anything like that.
Right. I'm not going to say that, but at the same time, I think if you are someone who is I guess a little bit less mature in your faith, maybe it wouldn't be a bad idea to avoid those things. Where if you are somebody who is more mature in your faith, you need to be vigilant about how these things are affecting you.
Yeah, but isn't that kind of an arbitrary standard? Not like super criticizing that idea, because I agree. Moderation is important. I mean, even when we started playing video games together again, it was hard for you sometimes to find moderation with video games because it was just... It still is, and it's something, I mean, you love, you enjoy doing, you enjoy playing it to relax and unwind, and there, like you said, there's nothing wrong with that, but there's not anything wrong with that, and...
Was that supposed to be a Seinfeld impression?
That was, you're welcome. It was bad, but you caught the references.
I did, yeah. Not that there's anything wrong with that.
Yeah, okay. We already talked about homosexuality, so we can.
Yeah, we don't need to get back in that.
We don't need to, but but there's always a thing called moderation with any sort of entertainment.
Yeah.
I find that hard, especially with a friend of mine when we used to do a wrestling podcast. There was so much wrestling in a week that we had to watch. There were so many hours of our day that got taken up watching this product. That we felt like that's all we did. So we stopped doing the podcast because we just couldn't keep up.
Yeah.
Stuff like that, I think, can be really great. It can be fun to have stuff you're interested in. It can be fun to be a part of a fandom. But like you said, binge watching, things like that. Just, spending every waking hour you're at home on video games or watching movies or watching YouTube. I mean, me personally, I'll be laying in bed just watching YouTube for hours, and I'll just be like, okay, time to get up and do something. Oh, there's another video I want to watch.
Yeah.
And it's because we just have this endless source of entertainment at this point.
Yeah, it's absolutely endless.
It's ridiculous. I mean, it's amazing in the sense of how many people can be creative and present things.
Sure.
But it's also horrible for that like self-control side of ourselves that we need to develop.
Yeah.
I think there is a truth to the idea of maturity, but I think trying to put spiritual maturity as an arbitrary term, because how do you rate what spiritual maturity is?
Well, yeah, I mean it's pretty hard.
I think it's more of a self-awareness.
Yeah, but I think like whether you label it as spiritual maturity or just maturity in general, that self-awareness, that self-vigilance is something that comes with maturity.
I would agree. In the context of religion, I could see how that religious self-awareness could be helpful too.
Yeah.
But I think it's us understanding who we are, where we're at, finding that balance in ourselves, and trying to stick to it. I mean, that's, like you said, that's mental health. That's mental, spiritual, emotional health right there.
Yeah.
Which I didn't expect us to be promoting that at the end of this conversation, but it is very much so.
And I think, like, and to tell you the truth, like, it's not something that I've spent a great deal of time studying either, and I've never really been a part of a Christian denomination that promotes this as a practice, or not necessarily that. Not to say that we would look down on it, but it's not something that we actually, advocate for our members, and that is being like a Lenten season.
Yeah.
But I actually I really enjoy that practice. I really think that's a good practice, and I think it's something that it's a practice that really shouldn't be reserved purely for the season of Lent. The season leading up to Easter. I think it should be something that we as Christians practice anytime that we perceive a need for it. Right. And so that being said, and you've already sort of alluded to the fact that I do enjoy gaming. Yeah. And I recently, I recognized that I was playing games just a little bit too much. And to be clear, I really wasn't playing them that much. But what would happen is, at the end of the day, the baby's asleep. It's quiet relatively in the house. I would turn on the game and I would play for a little bit. And what would happen is I would wind up playing for longer than I really intended to.
Right.
And I would wind up well, it was kind of cutting into my sleep time a little bit, and I realized that, hey, this is probably a little bit of an unhealthy pattern. And so right now, I'm on day 6 of a 40-day video game fast.
Oh, can I take your PS4 off your hands for a while then?
You could, but the next time my wife wants to stream Hulu, she'd probably be pretty mad at me.
That's true. You have a computer, you can use that. That's fine.
But yeah. Anyway, so I think that this, like, it's a testimony. This is a testament to like the need to be self-aware and to be aware of these unhealthy habits that you might be allowing to creep in. And it was all. I mean, all in all, on a grand scale, when you consider all of the destructive habits that somebody could have in their life that they could develop, me playing the video games was probably on the more harmless side.
Yes.
But I could see that it was having some negative effects, and the fact that it seemed like I couldn't simply moderate it.
Yes.
Right? So I just decided that it was best to step away from it for a while.
No, absolutely, because it helps you reevaluate that self-control. It helps you break the kind of the cycle that you would get yourself into. And then, at some point, getting back into it with that mentality, with that self-awareness, and being able to go at it with a different mentality. Absolutely. That's with anything, though, like you said. Any habit, anything. Eating, for me, even. So recently doing intermittent fasting. I found out how hard it is to tell myself no to eat something that's right in front of me. Or even doing a diet, obviously. You have food all around, and I was talking to my friend, and I was telling her, I was like, listen, I really want to do keto. But I am very low on cash right now. And I have like 5 boxes of macaroni and cheese and a bunch of ramen noodles sitting at my house. I want to eat those before I start spending money on meat and veggies just for a keto diet, rather than spending money on meat and veggies and still having this food here that I could be eating and not spending my money on.
Mm.
So it's just kind of this idea in myself of saying, okay, I'm making an excuse partially right now not to eat healthier.
Mm.
But then also with the intermittent fasting, what will happen is I'll go to work and I'll say, okay, I'm not eating until 1 o'clock, like after my lunch or whatever, because we can have food at our desks. So, like, okay, I can't eat till then. Oh, somebody just gave me a donut. Oh, somebody just gave me homemade apple bread, which is like this cinnamon swirl apple strudel deliciousness. I'm like, I literally sat today at my desk, those sitting right next to me the entire time. And for the first hour or two, I just kept looking at it like, that'd be really good to eat right now. That'd be really good to eat right now. And then finally being like, no. And then somehow I just ignored it. It was awesome. But I've realized this is the first time I've been successful at doing that. It's very hard for me as a person who loves eating food and who loves food and trying new things. Like, oh, there's this food here. It's being presented to me. I should eat it. And I've realized that was a very unhealthy cycle in my brain of almost like kind of like a hamster of when there's food in front of me. Oh, eat. Oh, there's no food. Oh, there's food. Eat, whether I'm hungry or not.
Mm.
And it's been interesting kind of doing this intermittent thing, which is completely just for weight loss purposes, not for religious or anything else.
Mm.
But realizing that it's having this implications as it's developing this self-awareness and kind of healthier idea of how I view food, and realizing the very unhealthy views I had of food.
Oh yeah,
that has been awesome.
yeah. I mean, for me even because I think we've been doing this for a while. I think we mentioned since we've been recording that I'm doing a keto diet too.
Right,
Yeah,
right.
okay. I wasn't sure. For me though, there is a spiritual aspect to it too. I mean, yeah, it is. For me, I hate to admit it, but there is a little bit of a vanity side of it as well. I actually had a little bit of a weight problem when I was younger, and ever since then, I'll be honest, I've had some body image issues, and I'm getting over that. I'm getting better about that. But that is something that I've had to struggle with. And yes, men can have body image issues too, especially when I see the God of Thunder in the Avengers movie with like an 8-pack, and I'm
Well,
like,
I don't know. The newest movie's not so much, but
I don't know. I don't know if I've seen.
Oh, you haven't seen it?
ones.
Oh,
No.
you'll get a kick out of it.
Okay.
Anyway, go ahead.
Well, anyway, so I'm mostly joking about that reference anyway, but for me there is like a little bit of a spiritual aspect of it, or to it as well, being mostly that, um, believing in the stewardship principle, which is in a nutshell is the principle that says that we are to make the best, the best, most responsible use we can of the resources that God gives us.
Mm-hmm.
Well, what is one of the biggest resources that God gives us? It is our body.
Yeah, it's us. Yeah.
And so, for
Absolutely.
me, the desire to lose weight and get in a little bit of better shape, means that it means that I'm going to have more energy to keep up with the ministry work that I'm doing. It means that I'm going to have more energy to spend the time that I'm not in ministry, pouring into and investing in my wife and my daughter. And it means that there's a very good chance I'm going to be around longer, and I'm going to be I'm gonna have more health and more longevity even later in life. And I'll tell you what, I have some family members that never really took very good care of themselves, and now that they're older, they're just miserable.
Yeah.
And I've seen the debilitating effect that has on them. And I said from a young age, I don't want that to be me.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So for me, right now in the here and now, it means more energy and more vitality to do the things that I need to be doing.
Right.
And later in life, hopefully that will spill into more quality of life. Now, understanding, of course, that just because I take care of myself now, it doesn't guarantee that I'm not going to have health issues later in life, but
Right.
it gives me a better shot at it.
It gives you a higher percentage.
Yeah, it does. So, I mean, things can happen. People contract illnesses that happens.
Kinds,
yeah, it happens. But I'm giving myself a better odds. If if we were in Vegas or something, that's how we would we would say. We're giving ourselves better odds. We're the house is still gonna win, but you know we're
because the house always wins in the end.
because the house always wins. But anyway.
All right. Well, this has been a very ranging conversation. I didn't expect some of the stuff to come off the did, but I think it's been fun.
Yeah.
It's been good.
Yeah, this is my first time ever appearing on a podcast. So
how was it?
It was interesting. Yeah, it was interesting. I wasn't really too sure. You know, I kind of came into it with no expectations, and so but yeah, it was interesting. I feel like this is not much different than the conversation that we would have on any other night that we had gotten together. But I guess that was kind of the point, right? So
absolutely,
I think we did okay, and I finished my milkshake here. So
and we have no boys in the yard, so we are good.
Oh yeah, in this instance, our milkshake did not bring all the boys to the yard.
All right, well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining Something to Drink On today. I hope you enjoyed your chocolate peanut butter milkshake, and catch you next time.
All right, see ya.